We live in an age of remakes and remasters. Every year, it seems we get more and more of these titles, ones that were either recreated from scratch to tell a similar story in a similar world, or ones that are enhanced versions of their previous selves. A remaster is often a nice visual treat, an update to an old game that brings it forward visually onto modern hardware. A remake is much more, a complete original recreation of a work to try and present it in a newer form for a newer audience. Regardless of how you may feel about remakes and remasters, they are reality, and I can almost guarantee that we will have some of these titles every year for the rest of our lives. But even as the number of titles receiving this treatment increased, there were always certain games that, in my mind, I couldn't fathom the industry ever touching because of their legendary status and importance to the medium. Could you imagine if tomorrow Nintendo announced they were completely remaking Ocarina of Time? Not the version they put out on the DS, but a complete remake. I certainly couldn't. That game is too important. It should be left in its original state to preserve the legacy of what it achieved. Although I suppose in our current day and age, money and capitalism can make anything possible. For the longest time, Final Fantasy VII was another one of those games that I had similar feelings about. Despite not having much experience with 7 as other people, I wasn't ignorant of its importance and achievement. And although the universe of Final Fantasy VII kept growing with supplemental titles, I felt the original was untouchable. Sure, it was brought forward and ported to modern consoles with some visual and gameplay tweaks, but there was no way they could ever remake it, right? Well, you know how the rest of the story goes. A tech demo for the PS3 set the expectation for a remake with modern technology, but it wouldn't be until 2015 that we would get the official announcement. Final Fantasy VII was finally being remade. But not only would it be a singular remake, rather it would be a trilogy series, greatly expanding upon the original story told in the 1997 PS1 classic. And of course, since patron saint of the Unlockables Tetsuya Nomura was overseeing the project as creative director, he was not only going to remake the game, but play around with the very idea of what it means to be a remake, weaving some of those ideas into the plot of the games themselves. As of this writing, I recently completed a playthrough of Final Fantasy VII Remake in December 2023 and have very recently finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Despite being games that are technically telling a continuing story, there are significant differences between the first and second game that I think garner some discussion. With one more title to go in the trilogy, it will be interesting to see where the finale of the series takes us, and what it will mean for the legacy of this remake trilogy overall. Considering I didn't have time to do an episode on 7 Remake when it came out, I figured now would be a good time to talk about the approach of both games and some of my thoughts and experiences. It should be noted that while I have played the original Final Fantasy VII, I've only completed it once, and that was a long time ago. So I'm mostly going to limit my discussion to the remake trilogy and not engage in theory crafting or speculation on deviations from the original. I know you've been getting a lot of Nomura content from me over the years, but we're breaking away from Kingdom Hearts. It's time to dive into Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. A word of caution, there will be some light spoilers on Remake and Rebirth, and some major spoiler discussion towards the end. You will be warned before that happens, so if you haven't gotten a chance to finish Rebirth, that would be your cue to stop. When I first think about the Final Fantasy series and what initially captivated me, it was definitely its sense of scale. I remember very clearly stepping out of the evil forest in Final Fantasy IX to rolling plains and towering mountains. My young mind couldn't believe how indescribably huge the world felt at the time. Similarly, I've had friends who love Final Fantasy VII tell me they felt the same way upon first leaving Midgar, as the world opened up to the possibility of infinite adventures. Obviously, these games don't feel quite as large as they used to, and we've gotten some games over the past several years that have an insane size and scope, capable of providing hundreds of hours of entertainment and surprises. When I first got my hands on Final Fantasy VII Remake, I was expecting some of the same, for a world that felt expansive. But what we initially got was an adventure contained to just the sectors of Midgar. The story of Remake plays out mostly in the different sectors of Shinra's Mako-powered city, and aside from some side quest opportunities here and there, the game largely pushes you forward through its narrative with its linear design and lack of distractions. Remake sacrificed a large amount of freedom in order to tell a story that was more focused on its gameplay and on its narrative. This was more in line with traditional JRPG experience, when the narrative takes precedent over giving the player perceived freedom to explore and discover. Now, even though we got a more linear experience in Remake, this doesn't mean the game's narrative lacked scale. Despite being confined to the hallway-like streets of Midgar, the story that Remake was setting up felt huge. It felt like the city was alive, that things were happening beyond the borders of whatever sector we were currently in. Events were constantly in motion while we explored the city. The main conflict driving the game also felt larger than the game's actual scale would suggest. Cloud and the mercenary group Avalanche were attempting to sabotage Shinra's Mako reactors to prevent them from draining the literal lifeblood of the planet for cheap power and comfort. The stakes felt bigger than the setting. Yes, we were confined to a city, but this was a problem that had worldwide consequences if it wasn't stopped. And we know that plot doesn't even remain the main plot of the game once Sephiroth gets involved. All the while, as you follow in the footsteps of FF7's story, you're guided by entities called the Whispers, harbingers of fate that ensure events play out the way they are supposed to. If you didn't think that this was bigger than some reactors and a fight against a greedy company, you definitely did now. Whispers, fate, ghosts, destiny, this stuff suggests concepts much larger than a city or even a planet-wide narrative. With these concepts lingering in the background of every decision, Remake's focused and linear story took on a sense of greater importance, something that would eventually be forced to spill out into the wider world. This wouldn't happen in the first of these 3 remake titles, with the story and game being fully confined to Midgar, but we knew what was coming next. Based on where we were in the overall story, we knew that the sequel would have to set us free in the wider world of FF7. How would the transition from Midgar's carefully planned streets to the sprawling world of the planet work in the greater scheme of the game we had just played? Surprisingly well, believe it or not. Almost immediately upon starting Rebirth, we find ourselves in a town on the outskirts of Midgar after the events that took place during Remake's conclusion. The town of Calm serves as a tutorial to how the Remake experience would translate to a sequel that offered more freedom, adventure, and choice. After a brief brush with Shinra featuring a daring escape, we're forced from the relative safety of Calm. As we emerge from underground tunnels, we get a Breath of the Wild moment, a prolonged look at the world now laid out before us. And what a first sight it is, as I was genuinely in awe of the rolling first area that we were allowed to explore, known as the Grasslands. As the world/main theme from FF7 plays, we head towards our first quest marker, fighting some wild enemies along the way. This one moment is profound. With a simple introduction, Rebirth tells us that it is going to be nothing like Remake. No longer are you confined to the cramped streets and sectors of Midgar. Rather, you're now free to explore the wider planet outside of Shinra's tighter clutches. This changes quite a bit, as you would expect. Rebirth plays largely like Remake, as we'll discuss in the next section when we talk about combat and gameplay, but on a much bigger scale. Enemy encounters are now dotted around the map instead of predetermined along a linear path. Quests are scattered about as well, some located in major towns you visit and others located in corners of the world you explore. Alongside these quests are events, discoverables, and icons dotted around the map for you to visit as you explore. These include things like Remnawave towers to reveal icons on the map, unique combat encounters, life springs that give you intel on the region you're in, and proto-relic mini-quests that unfold in several stages across the area that you're currently exploring. This has the trappings of a standard Western open world game, the kind that has been popularized over the last 10 years in a lot of major franchises. We've gotten sick of this model over the past few years, growing tired of icons sprayed all over the screen to distract us at every turn. And you might be tempted to think that this design philosophy infects Rebirth. But I would argue the opposite. There are lengthy portions of the game between major story beats where you're free to explore and check off objectives at your leisure. But when you do hit a major story moment in the game, you are largely locked into completing them until the game opens back up. The game even warns you at multiple spots that you will not be able to access the wider world until you complete the story section you are about to enter. This combination of standard JRPG linear sections combined with more traditional open world elements creates an interesting balance that enables the more focused storytelling of Remake along with the expansive freedom of Rebirth. That is, when Rebirth decides to tell you that story. You see, a lot of these so-called side quests and optional map markers are supposed to be optional. You don't have to do them. They're there so that you can explore and get more out of the world you are in. But their visual style and placement on a map wouldn't suggest that you have to do them. Rather, they feel a lot like other optional markers on other open world games I've played. You're free to skip them if you want to just experience the story, but I would warn you against this. While I did a lot of extra quests and side missions in each area before I moved on, this wasn't the case with some of my other friends and community members who played the game. They had tunnel vision for the story because they couldn't wait to see what happened, and this led them to telling me that at certain points in the game they felt underleveled and really struggled with certain bosses. When we discussed our progress and pacing in the story so far, I communicated that I always did all of the green mark side quests and at least roughly 50% of the icons on the map before moving on to the next area or story beat. This consistently kept me a few levels higher than the recommended level requirement for the next story section, while my friends reported that they felt underleveled. This, at least to me, made it feel like these optional side quests and discoverables were more than optional, but at some points they were necessary to keep pace with the game's level requirements. People who wanted to avoid all that and strictly experience the story would be at a slight disadvantage to those who took their time and decided to do more stuff in the open world. And I get it. I'm an OCD sicko who must heed the call of the icons on the map before I move on. That's the way I choose to play the game. Others just wanted to see the story and not get wrapped up in the distractions the world has to offer. Now, I think this is a relatively minor gripe. The game is clearly designed for you to interact with the open world icons and side quests as you progress. But if you're giving the player freedom to move from story beat to story beat as they wish, then the game should be balanced to keep them at a consistent level to experience that story. It almost makes me feel like the secondary content becomes necessary to do before moving on to make sure you're keeping pace with the game's progression. Again, I don't think this is an inherently bad issue, but it does tend to stretch the game out a little bit. It's also kind of a symptom of the way leveling and progression is set up. Let's be honest, we've come a long way from the days of grinding enemies to level up our characters. This element of RPGs has been significantly diminished over the years in favor of a more structured level progression that keeps pretty consistent pace with the entire story. I feel like the side quests are there to support that progression. If I ever needed to catch back up with the recommended level of a main story quest, I could do a few side quests, which would more often than not reward me with a ton of experience and put me where I needed to be. And with 1 or 2 levels being incredibly impactful, this was all I needed. Again, not a bad thing, and some would even say this is good design. But talking with others and thinking about the general structure of the game made it feel like these were almost required at some points. Speaking of extra things to do, Rebirth is chock full of extra wacky minigames and content aside from quests and markers in the open world. There were some minigames in Remake such as darts, whack-a-box, the Coliseum squats, and a couple others, but the number of minigames present in Rebirth have increased exponentially. There are so many different minigames across the world of Rebirth. The numbers vary depending on the publication and what you count as a quote-unquote minigame, but there seems to be anywhere from the high teens to the low 20s. These include a strategy tower defense game in Fort Condor, a Marvel Snap Gwent fusion-style card game in Queen's Blood, a carnival shooting game called Pirates Rampage, a rhythm game in Piano Performance, which is seriously challenging, and many more. I won't review each one, and some are certainly better than others, but the amount of weird extra games is actually kind of cool. For some reason, this has been a point of contention about this game. Some people have had an incredibly negative reaction to the number and variety of minigames, and let me tell you, I get it. Some are designed better than others. They are tied to platinum trophies. They are tied to some seriously powerful and useful equipment. Some are even required to progress in the story. I hear all of your concerns, and believe me, I think they are valid. I have had the same thoughts about some of the minigames in conversations I've had with my community members. But, don't think I didn't keep receipts. The same fandom who complained about the lackluster side content in Final Fantasy XVI are also the ones making the loudest noise about the intrusiveness of these minigames. As a person who loves 16, even I admit that the side quests and extra things to do in that game were not implemented in the best way. So now that we have a Final Fantasy game in Rebirth that approaches additional content and different ways to play on the opposite side of the spectrum, people are mad about this. You definitely can't have it both ways. All the side quests are the same in 16. Cool, here's some side quests with a wide assortment of minigames for variety. You don't get anything from the extra stuff in 16. Cool, here's different achievable tiers in the minigames that reward you with gear and resources. All you do is hit square in 16. Cool, here's a game where you ride on a dolphin or play Rock'em Sock'em robots or space shooter or race chocobos, in addition to the main combat loop. 16 is too linear, but here you are trying to skip all the side quests and minigames to mainline the story. All characters not named Clive get shafted in 16. Cool, each side quest you undertake is with a specific character from your party, so they get to increase their relationship with Cloud. I know I've strayed from the main point of the minigames, but you don't get to complain about a lack of things in 16, and then complain about literally everything Rebirth does in response to that when it zags in the opposite direction. What game are you truly looking for then? If it's something in the middle, that just seems kind of like a bland game, and you're welcome to go play recent Assassin's Creed games if that's the case. Believe me, I get it. I too was annoyed at times that minigames were part of the main story progression. I don't think they're perfect, but they gave us variety in the way that the original FF7 gave us variety. They give you something to do other than the generic fetch quests that were so loathed in 16. Something that gives you better gear and emphasizes the relationship between Cloud and his companions. All in all, the point I'm really trying to make is that the sense of scale between the first two titles in the Remake trilogy is very different. Remake was super linear, which isn't a bad thing because Remake does a good job of establishing the world and characters, and its mechanics largely hold up once Rebirth introduces you to a much bigger world. I was concerned about how Rebirth would follow up Remake, especially having maxed out my level and gotten all the summons in the first game. I was really concerned that these things not carrying over would be a huge issue. How can you depower my characters that I spent hours leveling up in the first game? But honestly, that doesn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. Once you're out in the Rebirth's world, you don't even think of that. And the two games really feel like they are telling a continuing story, despite being different in the sense of scope and scale. It's honestly impressive the difference in scale that the two games went for, but it definitely worked. I would say they pulled it off, and they had to, because this is Final Fantasy VII, after all. Since I played Final Fantasy VII Remake, I have long held the position that its combat system is the quintessential combat system that Square Enix has been searching for since the turn of the century. Ever since Final Fantasy X, there's been a desire to move Final Fantasy in a more action-oriented direction. As its cutscenes and stakes got bigger and bigger, standing in a row waiting to attack wasn't going to cut it anymore. The challenge was how to make it exciting and flashy while maintaining some of the strategic combat that fans of the series really loved. A dive into full action wouldn't fly. Kingdom Hearts already filled that role, despite the fact that Final Fantasy XVI tried to do that. Things started to change in 12, with combat taking place in real time, but still felt strategic thanks to gauges and the gambit system. Final Fantasy XIII took things a step further with the paradigm system, allowing players to shift combat styles on the fly to fit changing battle conditions, as well as introducing the stagger bar. Final Fantasy XV continued to trend more towards action, with combat unfolding in an open world that was fast, flashy, and less reliant on downtime in between attacking cycles. All the while, major combat moments were becoming scenes of absolute spectacle, as we see in 15's Chapter 9 or 16's Icon fights. But Square was never willing to commit to a full-blown action game until 16 came along, hesitant to fully leave behind its turn-based roots. 7 Remake had an impossible challenge. How could they make a combat system that lived up to fans' expectations? Most 7 fans had seen what these characters were capable of in Advent Children. How could they match that level of action while still paying homage to the original FF7 combat system? Well, as I've been saying, they did this for the remake trilogy, managing to strike a perfect balance of action, spectacle, and strategy. I can't think of a gameplay or combat system that walks this line more elegantly than Remake and Rebirth do right now, and it's pretty incredible. This should be the gameplay identity of Final Fantasy for years to come because it fits perfectly within the spectrum of Square's existing products. Think about it. Kingdom Hearts has already established that it is Square's action series with furious, fast-paced combat. Dragon Quest retains its traditional JRPG identity for the most part. With these 2 pillars having firmly established identities, where does this leave Final Fantasy? I think Remake and Rebirth are the answer. Similar to Remake, in Rebirth players mostly control Cloud, but have the option to switch between characters when deciding their party. I would say that your initial party members function in a similar fashion to the way they did in Remake. Cloud is your standard fighter and all-around good character. He can string together fast, hard-hitting combos backed up by his mostly offensive-focused abilities that he can execute when your ATB bar fills up, such as Braver, Focus Thrust, and Triple Slash. Pressing triangle activates his character ability, switching him from operator mode to Punisher mode, making his attacks much more vicious. I won't dive into detail about each character's kit, but controls are mostly the same across the board. Each character has a different role they kind of fill, and their triangle presses and abilities vary drastically across the board. In a way, I'm glad that we only had 4 characters in Remake to worry about, because the roster size in Rebirth is basically doubled, greatly expanding your options and customization. Red 13 is finally playable after serving as a tag-along character at the end of Remake, and his kit actually emphasizes him guarding and taking reduced damage to fill up his Vengeance mode meter. You can press triangle to activate it, greatly enhancing his speed and attacks, and even giving you an ability called Siphon Fang, which damages and heals at the same time, enabling Red to sustain himself in the middle of very aggressive combat. Yuffie joins the party next, a ninja from Wutai obsessed with materia. She has a great mix of ranged and close combat options, focusing on specific elements, and her ability to clone herself with Doppelganger is incredible. It's something that I use a lot in my playthrough. To round out the ever-increasing roster, the robotic cat attendant of the Gold Saucer, Kate Sith, joins our party for reasons? Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't really get this one. He has abilities dependent on riding his robotic Moogle mascot, which you must summon into battle and can serve as a decoy, soaking up damage instead of Kate Sith. Vincent and Sid are here too, but unfortunately we don't get to control them in this game, with Square obviously wanting to say something fresh for the final game in the trilogy. The materia system makes a return, once again providing the way for you to equip magic and additional abilities. Different weapons and armor have a different number of materia slots on them, providing a give and take when equipping your characters. Perhaps you want something with better stats, but it has less materia slots. Are you going to sacrifice those slots for a stat boost, or does your build require those slots? Making its debut in Rebirth is a new system referred to as folios, and this is basically a way for you to spend skill points you require on attack and passive abilities in battle, such as 5% attack buff or unlocking synergy attacks with your partners. I guess you could think of this as a super basic and light circle grid, but I don't think it's as in-depth as that. Speaking of synergy attacks, these are new team-up attacks between specific characters that deal damage or grant a buff. Some increase the stagger meter or the time fiends remain staggered, while others give you a third ATB bar to pull off more abilities. All this combines to create an action-oriented combat system that has a surprising amount of depth to it. It feels like the characters you bring into battle and how you equip them matters. There were a couple battles I struggled with that I was able to figure out with a party swap and equipment reshuffle. And speaking of those battles, they are very well done. The smaller encounters with fiends in the overworld aren't anything worth mentioning, but bosses, combat simulator challenges, and more difficult fiend encounters really shine and complement the battle system in a fantastic way. Each challenging encounter feels unique and encourages you to experiment with your party and equipment in order to solve it, almost like a combat puzzle. Figuring out the mechanics of each fight is incredibly satisfying, and getting an enemy into a staggered state to deal damage looks and feels amazing. Like I said, this is the quintessential Final Fantasy combat system, something it feels like Square has been trying to figure out for years, and I would be hard-pressed to think of one that merges action and strategy in a better way. There's something I worried about as Rebirth's release date approached. One of Remake's biggest strengths was its ability to tell a character-driven story. Remake expanded the scope of the original story, giving side characters like Jesse and the other Avalanche members actual personalities and arcs. This story was mostly driven through Cloud's relationships with the people around him, as well as everyone's tense relationship with Shinra. Each of the core party members in Remake felt unique and distinct. None of their personalities blurred together, and they all had interesting details about their lives that made them compelling. Most importantly, each were flawed in their own way, carrying with them a hurt or a burden that shaped who they were, not only internally, but in relation to their fellow party members. As with Final Fantasy XV, the cast of 7 Remake was the beating heart, and I grew to care about them far more than I had just playing the original Final Fantasy VII. Knowing the cast and scope of Rebirth would be far greater than that of Remake, I began to worry. I knew we would be adding additional characters that would have to be accounted for in the overall story. It was a problem I first really became familiar with while watching Avengers Age of Ultron from the MCU. Out of that movie's many flaws, I felt like it struggled to balance a bigger roster of characters, failing to give any one of them enough meaningful screen time to grow over the course of a 2+ hour runtime. I found myself worrying about the same thing in Rebirth. Could this game balance the amount of characters it was introducing? Would I still feel like the party could grow as individuals and with one another if so many were on screen at the same time? Or would some of them inevitably fade to the background as the prominent story of Cloud took center stage? Thankfully, I think Rebirth managed its stable of characters quite well. There are some moments that certain characters fade into the background as other characters in their arcs are highlighted, but this is only temporary. In Rebirth, every character gets their chance to shine alongside Cloud as the leading man. Most major story beats and events include the entire cast in some meaningful way, even when party members split up from one another in certain towns. Oftentimes, these moments are used to highlight key party members' relationships with Cloud. What's more, a lot of the character arcs intertwine with the larger narrative. Cloud and company are out in the world searching for Sephiroth after all, and in their journeys they travel through areas where some of them grew up, like Barrett in the Corel region or Cloud and Tifa in Nibelheim. It only makes sense that certain characters' arcs would be highlighted as the game goes on, but this feels natural, not exclusionary. New to Rebirth is what is essentially a very light version of a reputation system. Each of your party members has a smiley face gauge above their head that indicates their relationship level with Cloud. There are certain things you can do that affect this gauge in a positive or negative way, depending on your choices. First, there are very basic branching conversations. Nowhere deep is something like Mass Effect. Usually at certain towns or during certain breaks in the story, Cloud will have an opportunity to wander around and speak with his companions, beginning a conversation that will ultimately give Cloud at least 3 choices as to how to respond. The responses are weighted, so depending on which one Cloud chooses, the overall effect on your relationship will be different. This isn't an incredibly deep system, there are optimal choices, but having a higher relationship with certain characters rather than others will impact special scenes at certain moments in the story. In order to see those scenes with certain characters, you may decide to intentionally keep your relationship with other characters lower by picking the worst choices for the branching dialogue. The characters' relationships feel like they grow as the story progresses, and this light dialogue system enforces this in the actual gameplay sections as well. It's not super deep, but I think it is a complement to the overall story. In addition to dialogue moments, each side quest has a relationship component as well. Every side quest in the game has one of the main party members it features, and that party member features prominently in the side quest cutscenes alongside Cloud, indicating them as the focus. Upon completion of the side quest, said character's relationship will improve with Cloud. Synergy attacks between a character and Cloud also appear to affect their relationship, so there are plenty of opportunities to bond and build that relationship with your companions. This dialogue and quest system gives you choice to build the relationships any way you like. Skipping certain side quests or dialogue options will give you less opportunities to improve your relationship with your party, and could lead to you missing certain scenes between characters if you do this. That is why it's important to consider what you are doing and what the status of your relationships are. In addition, many of your party's individual arcs are incredibly well intertwined with the overall story as well. Usually when a work tries to balance so many threads and narratives at once, it has the potential to get messy or feel disjointed. This is not the case here, as somehow Square managed to give each member of your party their own individual arc within the grand scheme of things. Barrett has to come to terms with his past in the Corel region when he reunites with his old best friend. Cloud and Tifa deal with the awful memories and trauma of returning to Nibelheim. Red 13 not only has to come to terms with his imprisonment by Shinra, but also with revealing who he really is and who he is meant to be. Aerith, of course, must contend with her past and the legacy of being the last remaining ancient. They all struggle with some flaw or trauma that they must overcome, all while the lingering threat of Sephiroth and Shinra hang just over their heads. These people have a lot of different issues, and the way that Square manages to integrate their own personal journeys within the confines of the greater narrative framework without it feeling weird is impressive. Sure, I don't think it's perfect. I think there are some lingering issues with the story and narrative, especially when you do a bunch of side content, but this doesn't ruin the experience. It's always been implied since FF7 that Cloud and Aerith have this kind of will they, won't they relationship, but I never felt it was conveyed the right way. I think in this regard, Rebirth largely succeeds and manages to make the relationship between Cloud and Aerith feel real. Cloud, who is normally a stoic stick in the mud, is visibly more relaxed and comfortable around Aerith, and Aerith always exhibits these very subtle cues of emotion that hint at deeper feelings. And Rebirth doesn't make this feel cheesy or cringy in any way. In fact, all these moments are incredibly tender and treated subtly, allowing feelings and relationships to build up over time. Add Tifa into the mix with her and Cloud's existing history, and things get even more interesting. I've often heard this referred to as a love triangle between Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith, but I think Rebirth makes it feel more complicated than that. These are people who are not only trying to figure out their relationships with one another, but themselves as well, making it more than just a fanfiction choice of Tifa or Aerith. Tifa and Cloud experience actual tension in their relationship with one another, as Cloud's suspicion of Tifa and the events of his past are fed by Sephiroth's constant presence. My favorite Final Fantasy games are those that are carried by its cast. It's probably the reason why FF9 is my favorite in the series, as that game features an amazing group of characters that have their own narrative arcs running parallel to the main story. I see a lot of similar strengths in Rebirth, and I genuinely grew to care more about Cloud and company as the journey went on. I'd always known of Seven's characters, but I can't say I cared about them too much. But by the end of Rebirth, I genuinely cared and was invested in the personal and collective journeys of our heroes as they traveled the world. At the start, I was worried that Rebirth's overwhelming size and scale would make this an impossibility, but my fears were unfounded, and I walked away after completing Rebirth with my heart filled with emotion and a little confusion, excited for the conclusion to the remake trilogy. It can't come soon enough. Before I move on to my closing section, there is one last thing I wanted to talk about. This is it. This is your spoiler warning. I'm going to heavily talk about the end of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so if you haven't gotten a chance to complete it yet, this is your cue to tap out now. Check the timestamp in the description and go past the one that says spoilers. Again, spoilers for the end of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Go now, hurry before I start talking. Are you gone? Okay. Here we go. The original Final Fantasy VII is iconic in a lot of ways, but the moment it is most well known for is the death of Aerith at the hands of Sephiroth. This is, for all intents and purposes, the video game moment. I knew about this moment before I ever played Final Fantasy VII. It's been memed and idolized since the early days of the internet, and not many games have pulled off the same thing to the same effect since. When we first got 7 Remake, our imaginations began to run wild as we explored Midgar and came across familiar story beats. What moments would be recreated in this new remake trilogy, and how would they play out? Our excitement grew with the possibilities, until we realized, eventually, we would get to that scene, the death of Aerith. But things were not what they seemed. At the end of Remake, we seemingly freed ourselves from Fate's destined path, having a massive confrontation with the Harbingers of Fate. With a lot of the subversion and new elements added to the first installment, we began to see the grand scheme that Nomura and his team were revealing to us. This was not the same Final Fantasy VII that we've experienced before. It had the potential to change, to be different. Not only was it a remake of the original game, but sort of a commentary on remakes in general. So with Nomura in charge and anything seemingly possible, would that scene change as well? We knew it was coming in Rebirth, and why wouldn't we? Aerith's death is the perfect conclusion to this middle chapter of the story. As the chapters ticked by and the end of the game drew near, my anxiety rose. I could feel it. How would this momentous event play out in a shiny new modern game? Was Aerith's fate sealed? Or would the apparent multiversal, multi-timeline nature of this story somehow enable us to save her, as we so desperately wanted to in the original? The lead up to this moment is, for lack of a better word, a mess. As we experience the events leading up to the City of the Ancients, Cloud's mind is a mess, warped by Sephiroth's influence, and the cutscenes in the game reflect this. As we enter the city, we find our way blocked by dark whispers, but the party carves an opening through them just big enough for Cloud to push through by himself. As we descend, we finally come across Aerith, kneeling by herself and praying, similar to the scenario in Final Fantasy VII. We know what comes next. As we slowly push forward, time seems to slow down. And then we see it. Descending from the sky is Sephiroth, blade pointed down, ready to strike. Cloud, who overcomes Sephiroth's influence to prevent him from killing Aerith, raises his blade, and after an enormous effort, seems to successfully deflect the killing blow. But then there's a flash, a moment of static, and what can only be described as a quick shift. The camera pans to Sephiroth's sword, at first clean, but in a flash covered in red as there's a quick spray of blood. Although not shown, Aerith reacts to the impact and collapses in Cloud's arms, having just a few moments before she returns to the planet. What ensues next is a furious and emotional series of final battles that bring the game to an epic conclusion. A multi-phase, multi-party fight against Jenova Lifeklinger, and yet another confrontation with Sephiroth to close out Rebirth. And what is even crazier about this fight with Sephiroth is that Zack shows up for the fight, and the final phase of the fight is Cloud and Aerith together, after she just died. I have some issues with the way this scene plays out. This might just be my personal preference or the way I felt it should play out, but this is just my opinion. I am by no means a master of the lore. I am not entirely sure what is going on near the end or what it means in the grand scheme of the narrative. This might age poorly when we get to the third entry, so take it with a grain of salt. As I said above, this is the moment. This is the video game moment. It's legendary, it's iconic, it's emotionally impactful. And other than the shock value I felt from the fake out of Cloud initially saving her and the adrenaline from the insane fight that follows, I have to say I was disappointed. Rebirth does such a fantastic job of depicting the relationship between Cloud and Aerith as this kind of awkward, tension-filled relationship where you can tell there's something more than just friends under the surface. When Cloud shares moments with Aerith, he's a completely different person. He's more relaxed and he's able to let his guard down, as I mentioned before. When Aerith's death happens, not only do I feel that it's a little ambiguous with the fake out, but it's crowded by all of this fate, multi-timeline Sephiroth madness that is going on. We don't really have time to process what just happened or what is happening before being thrust into a confrontation that serves as the crescendo to this game, which involves two characters in Zack and Aerith who are supposed to be dead. Not to mention, at the end of the game where the party is getting on Cid's plane to head off to their next adventure, Cloud is still speaking to Aerith and we see her in a cutscene. I know this is to imply that Cloud still sees her, whether that is PTSD or some kind of weird fate shenanigans, but if they try to pull this thing where Aerith is like a force ghost in the next game and constantly talking to Cloud when no one else can see or hear her, it would certainly cheapen the death and what should be an emotionally devastating moment for the party and the player. Her being gone should be one of the key catalysts that allows these characters to develop further in the final entry of this trilogy. Listen, like I said, I don't mean to gripe and complain, and I understand that this is the way it happened and I can't change it. I am not a designer, a writer, or any kind of profession that influences the direction these games go. Is it Rebirth's fault that the moment didn't live up to what the perfect scenario would have been in my mind? Not entirely. We don't have a say in the games that get made, we can only play them and react accordingly, and not all things will resonate with all players. I've seen plenty of people say that this part was incredibly emotional, and they love how it was portrayed. I've also seen plenty of people who share my sentiment, that the confusing nature of these events that precede and conclude Aerith's death blunt some of the emotional impact that this moment is supposed to give you. But I'm within my right to sit here and say that I think it could have been handled differently. This should have been a much more intimate moment between Cloud and Aerith, and then between the rest of the people she traveled with for almost 2 games. Rebirth needed to slow down just a bit and recognize this moment for what it was, one of the most iconic and emotional in all video games. But it didn't slow down because we have a complex story to tell. For all of the praise that I constantly give Nomura, this is one issue that I sometimes have with him. He gets so wrapped up in his overarching complex narrative that sometimes he doesn't pause to let emotional moments breathe. It's actually one of the issues I have with KH3, and you'll see why. I adore Nomura's wacky, insane, fucked up storytelling. Multiversal adventures with branching timelines and all that madness, sign me up. I will eat that for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with a side of bacon. But in this moment, I think a little restraint would have gone a long way. But nope, we have a 6-part fight against Genova Lifeklinger to get to, and a Sephiroth fight with Zack and Aerith before turning the page to the final entry in the trilogy. Not to mention a psychedelic trip with Sephiroth as he vomits cryptic lines about confluence or convergence or whatever the hell he's on about. The whole moment left me unsatisfied and more confused than emotional. Is that my fault for not setting expectations properly? Is that Rebirth's fault for emphasizing its bigger narrative over the moment? I don't know, but I do know I wanted to write about it, and these are my genuine current feelings on the matter. Maybe with time I will think differently. Maybe as I watch lore explanation videos, the end will make more sense. But for now, this is how it happened, and I can't help but feel just a little bit disappointed. If you've listened to my show for any amount of time, you know the biggest project I've been working on is my Guiding Keys series, where I've been replaying all the Kingdom Hearts games and doing detailed episode breakdowns of my thoughts on the games. I've also been trying to piece together the grand narrative of the series in order to make it more approachable for newcomers who may be intimidated by its reputation. I spent a lot of time over the past few years reading about Tetsuya Nomura, Square Enix, and the teams of people who have worked on not only Kingdom Hearts, but other Square games as well. By the time I wrap up Guiding Keys, I'll have probably put out about 30 to 40 hours of content. And in all that time, I've gained a little perspective, not only on Kingdom Hearts, but also on the unique situation that Nomura, some of his team members, and Square have been in over the years. Earlier in the episode, I call Rebirth's combat the quintessential Final Fantasy combat. It's a fusion of over a decade's worth of ideas that have been tested and refined over dozens of titles. Nomura himself has been refining Kingdom Hearts for nearly 2 decades by the time of Final Fantasy VII Remake, culminating in the fantastic gameplay that is present in KH3. Everything you're seeing in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy is a culmination of nearly 20 years of work, not only by Nomura, but by the members of his team that have consistently worked with him. And this is something that is rare in the video game industry. The industry today is defined by upheaval, layoffs, uncertainty. People who work on one game may be gone for the next one, subject to the whims and wills of corporate CEOs looking to quickly improve their bottom line to satisfy investors on earnings calls. And despite the upheaval and questionable decisions that Square has made at almost every turn, there was never a moment where Nomura's position felt disposable. During the swirling chaos that sometimes ruled the day at Square, Nomura remained and continued to soldier on with his ideas, constantly looking for new ways to excite and surprise players, as well as honing his vision for gameplay as well. As long as he was making them money, Square was happy to let Nomura continue in this fashion, allowing him to fine-tune concepts and ideas over many titles. You can look at the long arc of his career from Kingdom Hearts 1 all the way to Rebirth, and see that Rebirth is a game that contains many ideas that Nomura has implemented before, improved over decades of experience. In many ways, this is reminiscent of his mentor and friend Hironobu Sakaguchi. Sakaguchi took similar approaches to his Final Fantasy games. As games like Dragon Quest stayed relatively static, Sakaguchi was always looking to improve and experiment. He never wanted ideas to become constant from one title to the next. For this reason, you have different battle systems from game to game, whether it's the confounding system in 2, the job system in 5, the materia system in 7, the junction system in 8. He always wanted to try and give the player a new way to interact and experience the game. Nomura is the same in this sense. He is the last bastion of Sakaguchi's spirit at a highly corporatized Square Enix, an embodiment of the things we loved about Sakaguchi's games, with his own passion for convoluted storytelling intertwined. Let me just talk about a few things that I've seen implemented in Rebirth that were ultimately perfected versions or snippets of ideas that came before. First, the stagger bar. Say what you want about Final Fantasy XIII, there's no denying that the introduction of the stagger was incredibly important, as it's now been featured in a few different titles as well as Remake and Rebirth. Stagger is incredibly important to success in certain fights, as you utilize an enemy's unique weakness to increase stagger dramatically. I already mentioned how the folio system has shades of the sphere grid from Final Fantasy X, although it's much more simplified. The fast-paced combat is clearly inspired from not only Kingdom Hearts, but Final Fantasy XV as well. I would say that the flashiness of the action combat finally begins to approach its Kingdom Hearts cousin. Whereas Kingdom Hearts has an element of hack and slash to it, Rebirth is much more focused. Just rushing in and mashing buttons will most certainly get you killed, and this is where the action combat system works brilliantly, not only with the stagger system, but with how they've implemented the ATB system as well. This adds a level of strategy to the game that is reminiscent of the old ATB systems. Attacking fills up your ATB bar, enabling you to use commands or magic that then deplete the gauge. When you go to choose commands or magic, time slows down drastically to give you a chance to make a strategic decision. The ATB system was incredibly popular during the PS1 era FF games, so it's great they found a way to incorporate it into this modern title while keeping the action going. The commands and magic also kind of remind me of the command deck system from later Kingdom Hearts titles, where attacks wouldn't be able to be used again until cooldown. This time, commands are only limited by your ATB bar. Speaking of the inspiration of Kingdom Hearts, synergy attacks between characters are eerily similar to the limit abilities that Sora performs with his different party members. I even felt shades of the Gambit system from 12 present in the Materia system. You can get materia that will let non-controlled party members cast link spells to that materia on their own without your input. This kind of reminds me of setting up gambits for your characters in 12, instructing them to act in a specific order depending on combat systems. It's certainly not as in-depth as 12, but it just reminded me of it. Everywhere you turn, if you stare long enough, you can see old ideas brought forward into what I believe is probably the best Final Fantasy package of this century. It hits most of the things you would want in an FF game while using ideas from other games as part of its overall identity. It's something that wouldn't have been possible if not for the long arc of experience that Nomura and his teams were allowed to accumulate over long careers. And while I love a lot of the past FF experiences in their own right, the FF7 Remake trilogy is definitely my favorite Final Fantasy experience since 9. It captures so much of what makes the series great and has me excited not only for the future of the Remake trilogy, but for Final Fantasy as a whole. Despite loud discourse from every angle, I've enjoyed the last 5 to 7 years of Square Enix. Out of the 5 new games I've played from them over that span, I've loved every one. Stranger of Paradise was insanity at its best. Kingdom Hearts 3 is one of the best looking and playing games of the past decade. I personally love Final Fantasy 16 and plan to revisit it for the DLC very soon. Final Fantasy VII Remake filled our imaginations, and Rebirth did the same, focusing on excellent gameplay and character-driven storytelling. As a personal fan of Square, Nomura, and Final Fantasy, I've been eating good, and no amount of angry yelling will ever make me feel bad about that. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to keep up with what's going on at the Unlockables, please go to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. You'll find all of the links to all the social media at that link tree. And as always, remember, it's not just the story of video games, it is the story of you.